going to do now is talk about another kind of exception handling. So that exception handling with HTTP response exception that's the good old traditional, always been there in Web API mechanism of doing things, the filters or the direct handling of the issue. In Web API 2, there was a new mechanism introduced, and it's fairly useful. It's very flexible. It can do a lot of different things. It can come at it a lot of different ways. And very often I wind up using a combination of what we just saw and some of this stuff as well. It really just depends how you want to structure any given piece of code. But in Web API 2, there's something called an action result. And it's a different way of going about returning data from a Web API action. So prior to this, you had HTTP response exception or exception filters, and that was pretty much it. In Web API 2, a controller can return one of four things. It can return void, in which case the default turning of it into a 202 or a whatever status will happen. A method can explicitly be configured to return something called an HTTP response message. So as a developer of the action, you can take fine-grained control over what the response is going to be and hand the HTTP response out through the return value. There's also an interface that defines an action result. You can return an HTTP action result. We'll get into how that happens in a few minutes. Or it could return some other type, data, string, object, person, in which case all the default handling that we've already seen of our methods are just returning person or collection of person. So you can still do that. But in addition to that, you can return this response message or action result. And each are handled slightly differently. All of them are turned into an HTTP response. No matter what you do, Web API is going to step in and turn it into a structured HTTP response. Even if it's HTTP 500, that's still a valid HTTP response. But you get a lot more fine-grained control now. So if your action returns void or nothing, then basically Web API is going to turn that into a response which is a 204 no content, and the response body will be empty. Okay? And obviously within your code you might be throwing other exceptions to override that, but that's the default behavior if you return nothing. Okay? If you choose to return an HTTP response message, you get to get very fine-grained control over what the response is. So you'll notice this get method, our get method returns @person or @IEnumerable of person. This one returns directly an HTTP response message, part of which will include the response data. So I embed the response data, if there is some, within the response message. And here you can see the example. The request method of the API controller has a method you can call that create response message. So it creates a basic default response message, and you can tell it what you want the response code to be. And then you can start doing other things, like, for example, once I've got the response, I'm going into its response headers control and setting a cache control header to a new cache control header value, max age is 20 minutes from now. So I'm doing some caching. I'm saying it's okay to cache this for 20 minutes. I could be interacting with the whole response.body, response.status, response.this, that, and the others. Loads of things that you can control. You get essentially fine-grained control of everything in the HTTP response, and then you simply respond with that data. Oh, by the way, you can notice here, when you create response, notice P obviously is my person object that I'm returning. So the request.createResponse, you specify the status code and the data that you want to go into the response body. So person P is where the response body is coming from. So that's a very good mechanism. Also, variation on a theme. This one works kind of similarly. You can declare your method as returning an HTTP action result. Essentially, in a large-scale environment, this is probably the way to go. What it lets you do is implement your own response message factory. So you can set up a class that is responsible for generating responses to actions, and you can have generic code that produces a response for you. Another benefit of this is that the API controller class itself has several methods that return an HTTP action result. And those methods are called things like OK, not found, and there are a few others. So a very simple way of returning things is to just return OK, return not found. And you can see here, for example, this is the action result pattern. But rather than using our own factory class to build our results, we're relying on API controllers' default behavior. So mReturn not found returns a 404 not found. And OK returns 200 and data. So it's just a very simple way of dealing with, certainly in a CRUD scenario where it's simple create, read, update, delete, it's like it worked or it didn't kind of thing. This is a pretty good pattern to use. If actions return some other type, which most of ours do so far, for example, IEnumerable of person, then Web API uses something called a media formatter. So it has built-in formatters that understand, again, based on the content types and accept headers and so on, I need to turn this IEnumerable of person into JSON, therefore I'll use the JSON serializer or the XML serializer or whatever. So as long as your method returns something that is serializable, then it will just step in and do what you need to do, and the response code will be 200 OK. Again, there's no right and wrong. Sometimes I use one pattern, sometimes I use another. It's usually a combination of them. So let's demonstrate Web API 2 using a couple of action results. So what we're going to do here, there's nothing really to do in our getAll method, because it will either return something or it won't. Let me get the code. Where are we? Here we go. So we're going to go through our controller again. Yeah, not much we can do here. You know, get me a collection of everything. There either will or won't be some in this scenario. In other scenarios, there could be, you know, other errors that could take place, but ours, there's not really much more we could do in this get method. It just returns the collection, which may or may not be empty. Let's look at the get1 method, just as an example of how to use action result, really. So I'm going to change the return value of the get method from person to @HTTP action result, okay? And then instead of this throw or not mechanism, I'm going to be a little bit more explicit. So if the person is not found, rather than throwing the HTTP response exception, and return not found, okay? Nice and simple. So not found is a local method on this class that I inherited from API controller. So I'm just calling a method that produces an HTTP not found status, essentially. Very simple pattern. And if it is found, then we simply return OK and the data. Okay, so there's a real simple example of using that HttP action result pattern. Let's just build to make sure everything's okay. Again, I'm not going to bother running the test. Nothing's really changed. We were doing that anyway, just through a different mechanism. So let's look at our post method here. So here, we're currently returning a void, so nothing. We don't have a return value, so Web API is going to turn it into a, yeah, okay, I did it. Okay, and yeah, we don't have any error trapping here at all. In theory, it can't really fail right now anyway, because if the collection's empty, it's going to create number 1, and if it's not, it's going to create number 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 or 6 or 7. So there's really nothing that can fail right now, but that's not really typical in a normal scenario. Later, we're going to look at adding some validation that says there must be a first name and there must be a last name, and the first name must not be longer than this because it's going to go into an alpha field and stuff like that. So there will be failures down the line, but right now there isn't. But let's just do this. Where are we? Okay, let's change it to add the location header. Let's do the correct. Oh, that's right. It's returning the wrong status, right? This one should be returning created and a location header. So let's change this to a HTTP response message and bring in that namespace. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to take fine-grained control over the response. So we're still going to do the find the new ID and create the person, but we're going to explicitly create a response, and our status code is going to be a created status. And to follow that recommended pattern where we tell the client what was created, once we've got our response, we can use response.headers. .location is the location header. is a new URI, formatting it to blah, 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 blah. So this will format the URL of the request URL and the person ID. And we need to then return that response. So mReturn response. Okay, so that one we will see a change in behavior. Let's go and test that and make sure that one works. So we'll do a build, we'll hop on over to Postman, and let's do the get all people. We've done a build, so we should get 1 and 2. There's our 1 and 2. Let's create person and do a send. Now we got a 201 created, that's good. And if we look in our response headers, we've now got a custom header that is location that says the URI for that newly created item is 3. So that's the correct pattern for doing a create. With the put method, the put method is currently not doing things great, so let's go to our put method. This is our update, remember, and what we're going to do again is take control over the response, so we're going to return an HTTP response message. Instead of doing a throw, if the item is not found, we are going to do a return request.createResponse not found, and we're also going to change to the appropriate no content response. Instead of 200 OK, which is the default, we're going to return the no content status instead. So that's improved that scenario. So that one was returning 200, and now it's returning 204 no content. Okay, and the final one, really just going through this now so that you've got a good example to take away. Basically, same thing with the delete operation. So again, we'll change it to return a structured response, and we will return our not found instead of throwing a not found, because that's the pattern we're now using. And again, we'll return no content instead of the 200 OK. So again, we're following the correct patterns for what HTTP should do. So again, I'm not going to run through all those tests in Postman, but essentially what we did was just clean up that whole API. There really are some benefits of this. It's doing this that makes the service look right and feel right and respond in an appropriate way. You know, it's what makes it self-documenting to a certain extent. Okay.